I'm neurodivergent zebra, and my brain is sparkly. Hey, today I really want to talk about this book that I just came across very recently. It's called Sensory Trauma, Autism, Sensory Difference, and the Daily Experience of Fear. And it's by Dr. Rorie Fulton, Emma Reardon, Kate Richardson, and Dr. Rachel Jones. The paper is also available as a PDF from ResearchGate, so I'll have a link to that, and as a published book, which is the form that I have it here. So I'm really excited about this because this is an idea that I have been working with forever, which is that autism, the sensory experience, the sensory processing differences that we have really could be conceived of and are experienced as an ongoing, constant trauma. So I was really excited to see somebody else addressing this idea and in such rich detail. So it's pretty long. Printed here, it's about 40 pages. So the PDF is like 23 pages long. So I just want to kind of walk you through the paper since it is a bit of a long read. And they start off with a really nice quote. Autistic people use their bodies, sounds, and words to declare that their sensory experience is different to that of non-autistic people. So if you listen to us, our experience is different to that of neurotypical people or allistic people. So they start off by talking about autistic sensory experience can be described, or has historically been described via two different frameworks. There's the autistic people's experience, and then there's the autism professional's description. And if you look at autistic people describing their own experience, you're getting like a body plus world framework. That's the only way to conceive of it. On the other hand, if you look at what autism professionals do, they're talking about a neurocentric explanation of our sensory experience, and it really omits the relationship with the world. And so it deems autistic behavior or response as abnormal compared against a norm or normal response. So there's an inherent assumption that the autistic sense systems operate exactly the same way as a non-autistic sense system. And they give a nice example of a door slam and people reacting differently. One person might have a really strong startle response where the other person kind of doesn't even notice it. And the goal of this paper is to create a space in which autistic sensory experience might be pondered free from any normative tilt or filter. So I thought that was really nice to, like, instead of trying to compare all the time, what if we just look at what people are reporting on directly? At this point, they also then define something called the sensory motor perspective. And they ask, what are the sensory and motoric experiences which underpin and motivate autistic behaviors? So they redirect the analytical focus away from behavior in favor of lived experience. And they're going to reconcile all this stuff with the concept of affordances, which is a word I hadn't heard before. So they define affordances. Affordances are neither in the environment nor in the perceiver, but instead derive from the relationship between the perceiver, the individual, and what is perceived, the environment. So I'm going to say that again. They derive from the interaction of the individual and the environment. And this depends on which information is picked up by the perceiver, which depends on the state of the perceiver, state of arousal, what your actual sense capacities are, what your emotional affect is. So all these kinds of things are going to affect even what information is being picked up. So they go back to this door slam, two people in the same room having a totally different experience based on all of these different factors. And affordances, when described in the literature, initially have only three categories. So there's physical, culturally selected, and social communication. So the physical affordance is what in the world literally can you walk on, what can you sit on, what can you grasp, what can you use. So it's just looking at physical objects. The second set of affordances are called culturally selected, and they give a great example. For example, a colander, a strainer, affords both rinsing salad leaves and wearing as a hat. But the latter is not a preferred affordance. So physically it can fit on my head like a hat, but that's not acceptable in my culture that I live in. And the third one is the social and communication one. So this includes writing and then all kinds of nonverbal behaviors and nonverbal communication that are acceptable in a social situation or not. And so what they're proposing is that there's a fourth category of affordance, and that's the sensory affordance. And they actually want to use this to reframe autism from being a social deficit with this like weird sensory thing in the corner to a sensory affordance difference. which can have some profound takeaways. So they say they want to draw attention to the ways in which autistic sensory experience is different than non-autistic sensory experience. This is an embodied relational difference rather than an embrained sensory deficit. So they give a great long example of an affordance, and they're going to go through all 4 affordances in this example. So 2 people are going for a walk. So one person is cold, so they're wearing a jacket. The other person is warm, so they're not going to wear a jacket. So that's a sensory affordance. Then the people walk up a hill, and one finds it really steep, and they have to stop and catch their breath. And the other one just charges on and has no problems at all. That's a physical affordance. They run into another person who greets them and asks them some questions. And one person stops to chat, and they're delighted, and the other person is totally put off by the question and just keeps going. So that's a social affordance, when and what can be talked about. And then they find a half-eaten chocolate bar on the road, and one starts to eat it in delight, and the other is totally horrified that they would pick it up. You don't know where that's been. So there's a cultural affordance, what is counted as acceptable and not. And then they return to the door slam. So people sitting in a room, door slams. For the non-autistic person, there's some level of auditory stimulation. And then there's either a surprise or annoyance reaction. It might go all the way up to stress or rage if that person's really activated. But you can draw a straight line between the sensory information that they pick up and the response that they have. Mediated by, that person and all of their uniquenesses. In a similar situation, an autistic person experiences pain, and that pain may be categorized somewhere between mild and severe, and so their reaction may be something like covering their ears and crying out. They may fall to the floor. They may actually attack somebody. But again, straight line between the sensory information that's being picked up and their response. So the autistic person isn't overreacting to some objective sensory event. They, quote, experience sudden, severe auditory pain and thereby a potential threat to life. The response was completely appropriate and understandable. If a non-autistic person experienced a comparably sudden and severe auditory pain, they too might drop to the floor or attack someone. So this isn't a disordered or abnormal response, but an interaction between the autistic body and the environment. And I do want to just point out here, which they don't mention, but there is an objective experience happening. You can get a noise level meter out and you can measure the loudness of that door in decibels, but that doesn't tell you anything about the sensory experience of it. Is this just a noise that I heard that was kind of mild, or is this registering as pain in my body? It's the same as the temperature when the 2 people went for a walk. The absolute temperature of the outdoors is whatever it is, but one person feels cold and the other person feels hot. So the loudness of the door slam in decibels doesn't tell you anything about how it's picked up as a mild noise versus an actual really loud pain. The next section they talk about is called testimonial. That was a term I didn't know. This means first-person narration of socially significant experiences. So it's like testimony, but it's kind of embodies this particular subset of testimonies. And the first thing they want to do is challenge the idea that autistic people lack empathy, intentionality, and theory of mind. These are old theories that have been around, and I think they're garbage. Anyway, they also bring up the idea that these are irrelevant and not correct autistic experiences. So they want to challenge the idea that autistic people lack empathy, intentionality, and theory of mind. And there's a lot of evidence that we do have all of those things. So they turn to autistic sensory writing as a source of knowledge about autistic lives. Imagine that! So they have pages of vivid descriptions, and the common thread between all of them is fear. And they're actually painful for me to read. I related to them so hard. They're so visceral. So I'm going to just read a few very quick excerpts of them. Of being terrified of loud noises. So much sensation streams in as if one were drowning in an ocean. Imagine having your senses turned up to 11. Your body reacts to sensory input in a way that signals danger. Beyond simply disliking a food, we feel a physical repulsion. Our body reacts as if the food is harmful. Made it feel like my skin is crawling to the point where it makes me feel like I want to rip my skin off. That's my number 1. Sensory attack. Fight or flight brain overreactive due to constant bombardment. Everyone and everything is a threat. The light seared my eyes. Tickling was so way beyond unbearableness that I simply died. So this is incredibly visceral language, and it's used to describe everyday activities: eating food, being touched, being hugged, walking down the street, being out in the sunshine. This is unambiguously the language of trauma, used to describe the most mundane of everyday activities. And so here's this idea of sensory trauma. So they start with a section about sensory trauma by defining trauma itself. Quote, results from an event, series of events, or set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. So it's the event plus the impact. The experience of a potentially traumatic event is thus subjective, and a particular event may be experienced as traumatic for one individual and not for another. So this is well understood. So sensory trauma itself can be viewed as an affordance. So there's the person plus the environment that they're in plus the impact on that person. So next they describe 5 features of sensory trauma. So 1, sensory trauma may eventuate from the ordinary activities of daily life. A principal distinguishing feature of sensory trauma, therefore, is that events or circumstances experienced by autistic people as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening may not necessarily be the extreme events typically associated with the experience of trauma: war, natural disaster, violence, abuse, and so on. On the contrary, the potentially traumatic events of sensory trauma for autistic people may be found in the commonplace activities of everyday life: having a shower, brushing your teeth, getting dressed, greeting family members, having breakfast, and passing your day in the company of other people in different environments. Perfect. 2, sensory trauma is latent in the environment. There's a sustained potentiality to occur at any time, moment-to-moment reality. And this is so true. The environment does not offer the autistic person an experience of safety, but instead one of threat. And this is my experience. I don't have a felt sense of safety. I am continually either experiencing something that's threatening or knowing that it's coming soon. 3, sensory trauma may be experienced frequently over the course of the day. Check. 4, sensory trauma is unavoidable. Sensory trauma cannot be readily avoided by autistic people in the normal unfolding of their days. Check. 5, sensory trauma may go unrecognized or be misidentified. An event may be perceived as inconsequential by non-autistic people in the same environment, if perceived by them at all. And non-autistic people may not respect autistic way of being, they may not believe the autistic person, and voila, you have challenging behavior. This can have profound consequences, including bullying, loneliness, mental ill health, health-harming behaviors, misdiagnosis, unwarranted medication, unwarranted medical intervention, arrest, imprisonment, or sectioning under mental health legislation. So these are serious consequences. So sensory trauma is both discrete external events or circumstances, as well as in the ongoing embodied experience of threat and lack of safety inherent in real-time autistic sensory experience. So it's so amazing to me. This is an aside. It just read somebody describing my experience so clearly. It is so validating. So then they turn to, what is it like to experience sensory trauma? So it is obviously beginning in the earliest months of life, if not at birth. And autistic people perceive fluctuating levels of threat in their environment, and in most environments where they spend their time, and may be in perpetual defense mode. Check. So here they take a second to talk about the autonomic nervous system, which mediates our response to threat. So autonomic means automatic. These are the things about our body that happen without us having to think about it, like breath and heart rate and digestion and all those kinds of things. Blood pressure. So the classic picture of the autonomic system is that you have the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. And the way I think about them is the sympathetic is you strike, that's the fight or flight. And then there's the parasympathetic is the peaceful one, that's rest and digest, rest and relaxation. So that was the classical picture of autonomic response to threat, is these 2 branches. Polyvagal theory expands that 2-part model. And what it does is that it takes that parasympathetic part, which is originally was just rest and relaxation, and it has 2 sub-branches. So there's ventral vagal, which is social engagement. So you're relaxed, but you're around people and you're engaged. And then there's dorsal vagal, which is a freeze response. So it's a low energy state, but it's a freeze rather than an engagement. And they define, in polyvagal theory, they define the term neuroception, which is the process via which the autonomic nervous system evaluates cues of safety, danger, and life threat without requiring awareness. So this is going on all the time. It's just another one of our senses that's happening. And the other thing that gets defined in polyvagal theory is the idea of co-regulation. So the capacity to self-regulate is built on ongoing experiences of co-regulation. It is through reciprocal regulation with another person of our autonomic states that we feel safe to move into connection and create trusting relationships. And when we're stressed, polyvagal theory says that we move through these states in a hierarchy. First, we try social engagement. So this is parasympathetic ventral vagal. So we'll go with appeasing or negotiating. If that doesn't work, we'll move into the sympathetic branch. So moving out of parasympathetic into sympathetic, and that's the fight or flight. And if that doesn't work, we go back into parasympathetic freeze. So that's parasympathetic dorsal vagal, and we dissociate. So now think about this for autistic people. Autistic person being around other people is not an environment that reliably provides an experience of safety. Social interaction itself can bring cues of threat more than safety. So a social engagement system is not available to us reliably over the course of a day. Polyvagal theory suggests that sensory trauma may thus be experienced in the autistic person's body as fluctuating yet persistent sympathetic nervous system activation, or fluctuating yet persistent parasympathetic nervous system disconnection, the dorsal vagus, or a combination of the two, with the range of accompanying physiological change that each of those implies. And this has absolutely been my experience, which was brought especially clear to me when I started doing a formal meditation practice. I could just feel the adrenaline flooding when I would move into fight or flight, and I could feel the dissociation or the almost disembodiment when I would move into a freeze state. And I was almost always in one of those two states. So think about all this. Thus, autistics experience states of safety and connection only infrequently, if at all. Check. The other thing they bring up in this is the parental interaction style. So even the most well-meaning parent may misinterpret an infant or child's behavior and either ramp up the interaction or become more distant, or they may alternate between the two. So ramping up may further distress an autistic child because of the sensory perception. That's like somebody in your face now. And it can impact attachment. So again, even the most well-meaning parent may not know what's going on. And how could they know what's happening with their baby, especially if they're non-autistic? So despite the parent's very best efforts and intents, the infant experiences deprivation of growth-promoting parental input, even when it is available from the parent. So the child does not experience co-regulation. The baby will tend to miss out on the experience of consistent regulating nurture, which the parent wants desperately to provide but is unsure how to, left, effectively, to manage their sensory trauma by themselves. The autistic infant loses reliable ongoing access to the social and pre-linguistic parental input that they need, and further loses reliable ongoing access to potentially regulating parental input that might relieve their sensory trauma. So it's a real difficult place to be in. So they discuss that repeated and prolonged sympathetic activation or parasympathetic disconnection may, over time, and as a function of the brain's use-dependent development, result in a state becoming a trait. So you could have an alteration in the threshold activity and reactivity of the autistic infant's stress response systems, with the result that the infant develops an autonomic nervous system bias, either towards sympathetic hyperarousal or towards parasympathetic disconnection in their response to perceived threat. The stress system response activates more frequently and for longer periods than is necessary, so it's like revving a car engine for hours every day. Check. And here's another kicker. If the child has a parasympathetic dorsal bias, so if they go into freeze and dissociation a lot, the caregiver may have little to no indication that the child has experienced sensory trauma. And that was me. So this is a toxic level of stress. This kind of sustained stress response in the functional absence of consistent and effective regulating care, because the child can't experience it, may be characteristic of sensory trauma as experienced by autistic infants and young children during the critical periods of early childhood, which actually organize brain systems. So they mention here as well the heavy duty of camouflaging and masking. So there's this normative pressure of social interaction to mask at the expense of sensory and emotional self-regulation. Check. So often autistic people are dysregulated in situations where we're masking. And they have a great quote. I feel like I wanted it tattooed on my face. "You have no idea how hard I work to appear this way." And there are a lot of consequences of this kind of masking. Anxiety, extreme exhaustion, depression, and it's a risk marker for suicidality. The suicide rate is very high in autistic population. So the impact of sensory trauma, it may cause us to preferentially focus on sensory affordances, perhaps at the expense of social and communication affordances. So now you can come back to think about reframing autism as a coherent idea. But they also are very careful to point out it isn't just a competing attention thing. The social affordances may not be accessible on their own, regardless of whether there's competing sensory affordances. So there may be a lot of layers of things going on here. And that this whole thing is rightfully understood as an adverse childhood experience, which is something I have long been trying to explain to people. So they close with some ideas for future research that obviously there needs to be more collaboration with autistic people to reduce the incidence and impact of sensory trauma. And as a side note from me, I would just say even having relevant validated measures would be really helpful. Because right now, a lot of the so-called validated measures in the literature are things that are completely irrelevant to autistic people's experience. And so it is not only not helpful, it can actually be harmful. It makes me crazy. And then, of course, parent education, so that parents know that how best to support their infants and their children as well as possible. So I hope you'll check out the article if that interests you, and thanks for listening.